Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 241 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cybulskie, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. Over the next few weeks, I'll be dropping news about some of the exciting stuff I've been creating for you lately, and new ways to share the medieval love. So stay tuned to the end of this episode for the first of these announcements. I've made it no secret that the thing that first brought me to the Middle Ages was stories, and I'm not the only one. For over 1,000 years, people have been captivated by the stories of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table. From his literary origins as a warlord to his transformation to the pinnacle of chivalry, Arthur's legend has been used as inspiration, entertainment, and propaganda. Over time, more and more knights have been added to the main story, as well as gaining spin-off stories of their own. And each generation and culture has shaped the story of Arthur to meet their own aesthetic and political needs. Since the Middle Ages, the Arthurian literary universe has been packed with characters and storylines for everyone, a tradition that continues today. This week, I spoke with Dr. Cawsey and Dr. Elizabeth Edwards about medieval Arthurian literature. Kathy is professor of English at Dalhousie University and the author of Images of Language in Middle English Vernacular Writings and 20th Century Chaucer Criticism, Reading Audiences, as well as loads of articles on medieval literature. Elizabeth is English professor at the University of King's College, Halifax, and the author of The Genesis of Narrative in Malory's Morte d'Arthur, and a whole lot of articles on Malory, Chaucer, and even Andy Warhol. Together, they've written the brand new and wonderful Broadview Anthology of medieval Arthurian literature. Our conversation on the changing face of Arthur, the way his legend spread across the medieval world, and the ways in which storytellers adopted and adapted his myth is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Kathy and Elizabeth, for coming on the podcast and talking about one of my favorite things. Thanks so much for being here.
We're happy to be here.
Yeah, it's good to be asked.
It is all joy for me. So you've just put together a book of Arthurian literature, and it's got all sorts of stuff in it. So I have a million questions. The first one always being, I think, where does Arthur first show up? Where do we see him? And when do we see him? Because I think there's a lot of debate. But in terms of literature, where is he showing up and when?
Well, the first bits, and we've included everything in this textbook, but it's really in the midst of time, one line here and there. And he wasn't originally a king. He was a dux bellorum. He was a war leader. And one of the earliest tantalizing references are to another person altogether, whose name has been lost to history, but who the only line I think was he fought black ravens on the wall, or he fed black ravens on the wall, meaning he killed a lot of people, but he was no Arthur. And that's it. And so you know that the stories of Arthur must have been famous, but they weren't written down.
There is some debate about whether there was a Roman war leader named Arcturus or something like that, but I think it's simply conjecture until the reference Kathy's got.
And around what time is this reference coming up? But do we know?
800?
Around
800?
Around 800, yeah.
And this one is one in Welsh, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So, and the earliest record we have of an incredible war leader is actually from around 500 from Gildas, but he doesn't mention Arthur by name. And so he talks about these battles and this strong warrior who kept people together, but frustratingly never says Arthur. And so we don't know if the two stories got conflated, if he's talking about some other totally different guy, but we've included that excerpt as the first text so that people can raise these questions and talk about them.
Of course. I mean, Arthur is someone that is always under discussion, right? Always in flux, always under discussion. But this begs the question, when you're putting together a book of literature, you have some stuff in here that might be considered history or chronicles. Like you have Geoffrey of Monmouth, who's famously talking about Arthur. What made you decide to put something that might be chronicles in with literature?
Well, I think there's, in the medieval era especially, there's less distinction between literature and history. So they didn't have the same idea of a true story or facts as we do now. And also the literature probably came out of some real person. I mean, why would you tell a story about this guy named Arthur if it wasn't based on something that the audience would know? And so clearly there's a lot of literature and imagination, but we wanted to include the chronicles as well, not only because that's where these stories might have started, but also because that becomes a real tradition as well. So later the chronicle becomes kind of the epic side of the story. And then we start contrasting it with the romance side of the much more fantastical parts of the stories.
Yeah, it's a really good question, because the extent to which these things are divided in the minds of medieval authors. Right? So Thomas Malory, who's a very late entry, one of his sources is Harding's Chronicle, and Harding's Chronicle is pretty much a straight up chronicle. That's what it intends to do. And then there's, after our period, there are arguments. Even the Protestant revolutionaries will cite the Arthurian legend as proof of the independent evangelization of England. So they're using it for very political purposes, as if this were a historical fact. And yet it's already under question in the 14th century. Capgrave, I think. Yeah.
Well, and even earlier, Geoffrey of Monmouth says, I'm writing fact, and his audience says, yeah, right, we don't believe you. You're making stuff up. And so it's a bit of a mistake to think that we are the only generation that questions, the truthiness of stories. There, people at the time would say, yeah, this is made up.
Yeah, I remember looking at Caxton's preface, I think, to Malory and saying, I've been asked to create this. I think he said he's been asked to create it for Edward IV, and said, Edward thinks, this is great. Some people think that Arthur's not real, but, the king says he is. That's good enough for me. Basically, I'm like hugely paraphrasing here. But yeah, the idea of there being a question is ancient, as ancient as the stories, which I think is really interesting.
Right.
Well, and also Arthur is used often for political purposes.
Yeah.
So we included one that Gerald of Wales finds Arthur's body magically, and that happens to be at the moment when there's an uprising in Wales and people who might use Arthur for political purposes. And then I think Edward III had the Order of the Garter, and all of this was totally based on Arthurian myth and so on.
Mm.
Yeah, that's right. And we have Edward I, who is famously burying Arthur's body. He is not the future king. He is the once king, and that's it. Yeah, used for political reasons all over the place. This might be totally out of your scope, but before we leave the political question, have you found in looking at the Arthurian literature and stuff like this that it's mostly political in England? Like, I know that in the 14th century, we have the Order of the Star showing up in France. But I think it's just leaned on politically mostly in England and Wales. Do you think that's true? I could totally cut this question out if I've stumped you.
That's a really good question. I hadn't thought about that. I mean, in modern day, it goes well beyond England, because like JFK's court was called Camelot, right?
Right.
And then white supremacists are using the Arthurian legends and myths about the Middle Ages all the time for political reasons. I don't know, mainly because I mostly do England. I don't know of any other part of Europe that used Arthur for political reasons, but I don't know that they didn't.
It's a false separation in a way, since there's so much French in England.
Right. And
some of the texts we've put in here that are French texts are actually written by authors residing in England. Marie de France, for example, she's de France, but she's writing in England. And when you think of Chrétien, he's at the court of Marie de Champagne, who is a daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine, who's imprisoned in England at the time. So I think that there are, certainly in the early period, there are political ramifications. I'm just trying to think of the German texts. I don't know enough about the context there to comment. But I think in France, they can include intellectual concerns and political actions. There's things in the Vulgate cycle, for example, about the doctrines of confession. This is very current stuff at the time that work is written. So whether that's directly political or just intellectual milieu, but yeah, I think especially for the early period, it has those consequences.
It's a tricky question. I'm going to steer us back to easier ground here. But I just
Okay.
wanted to bring that up because, I think about this stuff all the time. I know how much she's used for propaganda. And I just thought, I only see this in the English French context. All right. So, safer ground. We start seeing Arthur popping up in literature in the early Middle Ages. Where do we find this boom? Because there is a boom in Arthurian literature. When does this happen and where?
Well, I
Or
think that with the troubadours in southern France, there's a real shift in what constitutes a worthy subject for literature. And I had a prof who would say that we are still in 11th century France today because we think that romantic love is, if you haven't loved, you haven't truly lived. And we've now expanded it to include not just heterosexual love, but we're still in that mindset, right? And you don't have to have it be a happy love, but there's that idea that love is the most important event of someone's life. And that wasn't the case before. And in a lot of societies, not that they didn't fall in love, but that this wasn't considered the key moment. And so where this comes in is people start writing Arthurian stories as romances, as love stories. And they start including, if you look at the women in Geoffrey of Monmouth's text, they are not really real women. Whereas in Chrétien de Troyes and Marie de France and all of that, they start including more women. And so I would say that Chrétien de Troyes is really the explosion. And so he was writing in poetry, and then that turned into these large, sprawling prose texts that were translated and retranslated. And the analogy I use in my classes is the Marvel universe, that you've got this framework, but then, and so you can, if you're writing a new story, you can either take one of the characters and write a new story for it, or you can invent another knight off on a quest doing his own thing. And some of those knights, like Chrétien actually introduced Lancelot, so he's quite a late introduction. And he became the core. You can't envision a story about Arthur without Lancelot. But other introductions, other new characters that was a one-off story and nobody picked up on it. So I would say 12th century.
Yep. I thought you were going to start with Geoffrey of Monmouth.
Okay. Well, Monmouth was the chronicle, and he did turn it into more of a narrative. This is a point of debate as well, and clearly Elizabeth and I don't even agree. But yeah, Monmouth was also influential. Why would you say Monmouth, Elizabeth?
Just because he was so incredibly influential. And also, I guess I'm thinking a bit backwards about the political structure of these stories. So he's really doing a rehabilitation of the Celtic hinterland, I guess I would say. So you've got a very long socio-historical memory there of Arthur's is set in the Celtic world, which somehow is still holding on, even though the Saxons have taken over England 600 years ago or something like that. So it has that kind of function that comes in and out of focus throughout. I don't think we disagree, Kathy. I think Chrétien is the beginning of the great literary effort. And we go backwards from there in a way because of the literature.
I think it's a good point to note when Chrétien starts writing, especially Lancelot, because as you're saying, Kathy, before this, there's no adultery in Arthur's court or anything like that. And adultery is like that central point of courtly love, right? It's just this overwhelming love. You're a slave to it. You can't do anything about it. And it's been like that ever since. But there is such a shift. And I think both of you have picked out the important moments. Geoffrey of Monmouth making this such an important part of the history that you need to everyone needs to recognize that Arthur's part of history. So much goes back to him. And then we have Chrétien with the literature. So then it starts to explode across Europe. And you have some really amazing examples in your book of places where, when I was studying this many moons ago, we were always looking at England and France. But you have some stuff from Iceland in here. You have Merlin's prophecies written in Icelandic. Let's start there. What's happening in Iceland?
Well, that was Matthew Roby, who's teaching at Mount St. Vincent University, and he was the one who translated those texts. And the problem that we faced when putting this together was we wanted to show the geographical spread and the chronological spread of these Arthurian stories. But when Geoffrey of Monmouth gets translated into Polish or, Catalan or whatever, then we can't expect our students to read Polish and Catalan And so one of the problems we had was that we faced the problem of showing the way that this was translated into all of these languages. But then having those actual translations back in English, it would be the same story over and over again, and you'd miss the nuances that come with translation. And so Matthew Roby did that with the Merlinuspa, or suggested the Merlinuspa. And then I also found the Melek Artus. And these are texts that don't just translate linguistically, but transform it culturally. And so Geoffrey of Monmouth and the Merlin's prophecies and so on were in pretty much every single language in Europe. But what they did in Iceland and in Old Norse was they had this established tradition of prophecy, which is not common in Europe. And so the poetic Eddas and so on, they had this language for prophecy. And usually when you're translating into the Old Norse is you take poetry and you put it in prose, because they also had all the sagas, which were in prose. This is really unique, and I'm so glad Matthew pointed it out to us, because it takes prose and turns it into Old Norse Icelandic poetry. And it not only turns it into poetic forms, but it uses poetic forms and quirks specific to Old Norse. And so it uses kennings, which your folks might know from Old English, because those come into Old English as well. It uses pagan mythology. Some of the kennings, you can't even figure out what they're talking about without knowing all these pagans' myths.
Can I just get you to explain kennings for the people who don't know what they are before you continue? Sorry.
Yes. So a kenning is when you take two nouns and combine them in kind of what's a mini poem or a mini riddle. And so it's a poetic phrase for something. So the common kennings are in Old English would be the sea is a whale road, or a book is a word hoard. And so those are pretty simple English kennings. The Norse ones get more complicated. And so you can have, I think, the incident where Merlin sees the dragons at the bottom. Those are earth girdles. And so that requires, first of all, a girdle or a belt is long and skinny like a dragon or a snake. But it's also refers to the pagan background, because in pagan mythology, there's a dragon that is circling the earth. And so that has become a kenning for dragon. And so you have to know that myth to be able to figure out what this is talking about. So we took this, and Matthew suggested this poem to us as an interesting example of Norse Arthuriana. There's lots of other poems that have been put into Norse, but this was a really unique one. And we took that as a way to select other texts for this book. So we looked specifically for not just translations, but cultural transformation. And so we have a Jewish text trying to put the Holy Grail into Judaism. Is a bit of a tricky thing to do. But he used it as a tamchui, which is a Jewish almsgiving platter or serving dish of some sort. And then we have a Greek text that uses this, and again, this doesn't come through quite so well in translation, but it uses Old Greek hexameter and kind of verse forms and a lot of allusions to the Old Attic classical writing. And so we've included things like that rather than just having this text, which, you know, you can read the footnotes and know that it was translated into Polish, but it sounds exactly the same as other texts because we had to translate it back into English.
Those were two texts that I'd actually never heard of before. Some of the ones we've chosen have come more to prominence lately because of certain contemporary interests, which we're also interested in. So the Roman de Silence, for example, it has the gender politics that we're all keenly interested in, and there they are in the Middle Ages. So works that were treated very marginally with footnotes or small entries in the Arthurian encyclopedias and so on, when you read them, you think, whoa, this deserves to get better attention.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was going to ask you about Silence. So, Elizabeth, can you give us the quick notes on the Romance of Silence? What happens in it and why have you included it?
No, I'm going to turn that back over to Kathy.
Okay, Kathy.
we didn't actually, I mean, this is on the very borders of Arthuriana because Arthur is not the king. And it doesn't mention, I think it mentions Arthur as a historical figure, but it doesn't actually, it's not actually taking place at an Arthurian court, but Merlin shows up. And so we decided, okay, this counts as Arthuriana because Merlin is there. The story is of a couple that has a girl, and the king has recently changed the inheritance laws, so girls can't inherit. And so they decide to bring up Silence as a boy. And so most of the romance is dealing with this. And we included only a little bit of that. There's a debate between nature and nurture, which could have, other than the fact that it's allegory, it could fit in right in the trans debates right now. Are you more the way you're brought up? Is this sociological or is this biological? But the part we did include was this Silence is very successful as a man. And the interesting thing is that the pronouns, when Silence is dressed in male clothing, the author uses he. And when they are in female clothing, they use she. And at the end of the romance, the king wants to capture Merlin. And so Merlin famously can never be captured except by a woman. The king thinks he's getting rid of Silence because his wife wants to sleep with him and all of this. And so Silence, as a trans person, is able to capture Merlin. And so then there's this very cool part about Merlin in the text. And it's a bit of a different Merlin than in other ones because it's a real trickster Merlin. So again, we included ones that show different sides of the characters as well.
It's an interesting one because, like you say, there's a lot of play with pronouns and stuff in that. And then at the end, of course, the author has to say, well, it's hard to find a good woman. The best woman is a man. Obviously. And, it's interesting to see medieval people playing with this gender idea. And the Arthurian literature gives you a real space to do that, to play with ideas. And so that makes me think of one of the other ones that you brought in that I hadn't seen before, which was the Middle Dutch Morian. So can you tell us about that one? That is a really interesting one as well.
Well, that one, was it Siobhan who brought that to our attention, Elizabeth? I think
it was, yeah, because she works on the Saracens.
Yeah, Siobhan Kalkin at University of Carleton, I think. And so this is a Dutch text. We were trying to be diverse, not only in geographically, but also in showing the diversity of subjects, of people. We've talked about genders. So we wanted to include some Black characters. As far as we know, we didn't manage to have a Black author, but Black characters were not too hard to find. But this one was unique because it's a really positive portrayal. And so the story is that Morian's father was, I think, married to, or at least betrothed to, a Moorish princess, but then went off on adventures before he knew that she was pregnant and never came back. And so this kid grows up very strong and handsome and knightly and goes in search of his father. And what was interesting about the story is that they really lean into his Blackness. He's described as blacker than pitch, blacker than coal, black burnt brands, I think. And he fights Lancelot to a standstill. And Gawain has to intervene because he's so worried that one of them will get seriously injured. And then they go on adventures together. And we, didn't include all the adventures. We included just very short excerpt. But the other key part of it is that all of the knights of Arthur's table take Morian as a good knight and as a worthy companion. All of the peasants and ignorant people in the stories say, oh, he's a black devil, and they run away from him. And then there's actually a line where I think it's Gaheris says, this is foolish. You shouldn't tell what a person is from the outside. Inside, he's as good a knight as I am. And so we thought this did two things. One is it has a really strong, really positive Black hero, but it also shows that, we're not trying to say the Middle Ages wasn't racist, because I think it probably for the most part, yeah, because it was. But we tried to show that it wasn't, and this is what you do all the time in your podcast. People did not think, the same thing all the time. And so some people were very racist, but some people weren't. And so that is encapsulated in this story, that there's this diversity of opinion. And it doesn't hurt that the overall message is don't be racist because you want to be like Arthur's knights. You know, the good people in the story aren't racist.
Yeah, absolutely. You have the best knights in the world, and they are just cool with it. The excerpt that you had, I think Maureen has trouble getting on a boat because the fishermen are just like, they're so racist and they just imagine he's a devil or something. And I can't remember which knight it is that helps him out, but he's like, I'll get the boat and then you'll get on it with me. And if they have a problem with it, they can take it up with me. And it was just like, wow. Like you say, there are people of color all over Arthurian literature. It's not weird to find them, but the snippet that you found, I think, really gets at the fact that people are people in that you have some people that are terrible, you have some people that are great. And it comes up in Arthurian literature just as it would in real life. And I love it. This is why I love Arthurian literature. Okay, so we're talking about having snippets of different kinds of poems in here. And the one that you kept fully together is, of course, my favorite, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. So can you tell us why you kept this one together when the other ones you had to sort of pick and choose?
Kathy edited that, so I guess we'll let her speak again.
Well, yeah, no, I didn't. I think I wrote the introduction, but we're actually using James Winnie's edition.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. So that edition is really nice, and I've taught with it. It's another Broadview, and they allowed us to reprint it. But I love having the parallel text because at a second year level, this is too hard a dialect of Middle English to teach. I teach it at a fourth year level, but at a second year level, it's too hard. But it's so evocative and it's so exquisite and it's so stunning. And so you can read the modern translation, and it's again a really lovely translation, but then look across, or the teacher can read out little bits of the parallel translation. I mean, we are in some sense trying to be all things for all people, and we probably failed, but we wanted to make a textbook that you could either, and maybe do both, you could have the chance to teach a full text quite deeply. And so we included Chrétien de Troyes' Knight of the Cart, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. What other full texts? I think Lamballe we included. Sorry, the full Chaucer. Yeah, the Wife of Bath tale. So you can teach the whole tale, or you can teach all these little snippets. And so that is a chance to really teach Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which isn't as popular as, I mean, we only have one manuscript, right? But I have now not yet encountered a medievalist who doesn't think it's a good piece of literature. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, really. If there's one thing that we've kind of missed necessarily, it's the sheer bulk and length of this literature. There's a book called Literary Fat Ladies. That's what it means. It means these great big doorstop books. So you can't do justice to that. So we're trying to, in a way, lure people along with the snippets, I guess. But a text as important as Gawain and the Green Knight, and how would you ever cut that up? What could you leave out?
Yeah.
It wouldn't work.
It would not work in excerpts.
No. And I think it is such a great example to have in here, because one of the things that I'm hoping that we're seeing less of, people throw back at the Middle Ages, is that it's not complex, it's not deep. And sometimes you read something like the Stanzaic Mort or something like that, where it's pretty simple. It's pretty like straightforward. Then there was Uther, then there was Arthur, and it's just kind of straightforward. So it can be easy sometimes, I think, if you're just reading it straight, to see maybe not all that much complexity. But when you see the psychological depth of a poem like Sir Gawain, I mean, it's so important to have it in there. And I was delighted to see it in its full capacity and with the facing translation, because it is tricky, but so beautiful at the same time. So yeah, I was happy to see it.
Well, and the poetic, like not just psychological complexity, but poetic complexity. I'm going to push back a little bit at your Stanzaic, because I mean, but I read an article, and I'm blanking on the name, but that I taught this year, that if you look at the rhymes of the Stanzaic Mort, there are these rhyme patterns that are linked to each of the main characters. And so it's really fascinating the way that Lancelot and Gawain at the end of the poem are fighting, but Guinevere is there in her rhymes, lying by, because she's the cause of the fighting. And so I taught this text this year, and some of the works that I thought, I don't like this as much as Sir Gawain and the Green Knight or Mallory or whatever, I really have developed an appreciation for.
Yeah, I knew as soon as I threw it out, I'm like,
I know.
Actually, it's really complex, but I'm sticking with it. I'm sticking with it. Yeah, you know what I'm saying. Yeah, sometimes it can be, if you just read things at a surface level, what I'm trying to say is some texts you have to work harder for. Maybe that's what I'm trying to say.
I'm going to totally agree with you. Kathy worked on that text, and yes, it's rewarding and it has things. But I think the takeaway might be there's all kinds of levels of social class and readership that are imagined in these texts. And I would think the stanzaic is a more, I'm going to say, popular version. We can't think about class the way people used to do, which was to say the upper classes, they were romance, and the lower classes were fablio. Okay, so hopefully we've totally moved on from that. But I think there is a simplicity to the stanzaic mort, which is also part of its charm.
Yeah, thank you. I remember being charmed by all of these. And again, it's a huge part of why I became a medievalist. But sometimes, I don't need to defend myself anymore on this.
I think there are some texts that you could read again and again and again and again for the rest of your life and still find new things in them. And I think Sir Gawain and Mallory and so on are those. Maybe I'm also shortchanging the stanzaic. The alliterative mort I've actually come around to enjoying much more thoroughly as well. And Elizabeth did a brilliant translation for us. And a lot of the students that I taught this year talked about her translation being really powerful. So that was one that we chose not to include in a parallel text. And so we just gave the translation. But I think Elizabeth did a good job of retaining the power of the original Middle English in her translation. She's turning red right now.
Yeah, I am. I also thought the Middle English is not difficult enough, if that makes any sense. It would have been quite repetitive to have, especially because I was trying to follow in as much as I could the language of the text and just make it so that it was even more readable. But, you make those bargains. It's still too difficult, I think, for second year undergrads to just motor on through. There would be lots of obstacles. But on the other hand, it's much more recognizable than Sir Gawain and the Green Knight as English.
Yeah, I mean, there's some arguments and debate about the fact that Gawain might be meant to be fancier, flowerier, and more difficult. But okay, so we're talking about mort. What we mean here is the mort d'Arthur. So it's usually the entire story of Arthur. And we have the stanzaic one, which means it's just in stanzas. And then we have a alliterative one, which means that it's got an alliterative structure. And that's what you worked on, Elizabeth. So why would you have both? Why would we tell the story twice?
Or 3 times, I think.
We also have Mallory's prose, Yeah,
we could have had something from the French Mort d'Arthur too, which is a brilliant work and completely different from the English ones. Well, I think it's partly to give you the flavor of what's out there. There's a kind of Middle English poetry, there's a lot of it, that is sort of like the stanzaic. In fact, the stanzaic mort is much more like a lot of Middle English romances. I don't know if I'm going out on a limb here. And unlike the French ones, the alliterative mort, though, on the other hand, is retaining the great tradition of alliterative poetry that's coming out from Old English and is undergoing a revival, as they call it, in the 14th century. And there's been a great deal of very interesting work done on this quite recently. It used to be held that the Middle English alliteration was like a weaker form of the Old English, and new prosody and poetics has uncovered the secret structures that mean it's very much its own thing and is following a different set of rules. Yeah, I could go on about that. But as one of the most important literary forms in medieval England, it's really nice to get a sample into our sampler.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the other thing is that it shows, like, having the basic plot be the same you couldn't find more different texts than the Stanzaic Mort d'Arthur and the alliterative Mort d'Arthur.
Yeah.
Like you just could not. Their emphasis is different. Their interests are different. Their form is totally different. That's why we categorize them according to form. The parts that they slow down on and gloss over and speed up are different. The psychology of the characters is different. And so I think it's a really good way of showing what an author can do with these bare bones of the plot, and also showing how different people did different things for Arthuriana, whether it's because of their own interests or their audience interests or the cultural milieu that they were in. And it also forces students to get beyond plot because everybody knows what's happening, right? And so they have to look at how the author does it. What do they do with these basic plots? How do they make Guinevere seem real? How do they make Lancelot seem real? How is this Lancelot different from Chrétien's Lancelot or Mallory's Lancelot? All of those things. But Lancelot hardly ever comes into the alliterative Mort at all. And the Stanzaic Mort is all about Lancelot and Guinevere.
Yeah.
I think that probably, and you can tell me if I'm wrong here, has to do with the fact that Lancelot is so French. And if you're reviving, you know, a Celtic tradition or a British Isles type tradition, you would want to have less Lancelot. Turn that volume down on Lancelot a little bit. But I think that you were getting at comic books or comic book movies earlier, Kathy, and I think this is a really important point to bring up, in that everyone knows what happens to Batman, but how many Batman reboots do we have? Like, everyone knows what happens to Spider-Man. How many reboots do we have? And it's just because everyone knows what the nugget of the story is, you can start to shape around it. And that's really what's happening. Okay. So the ones I was hoping that you would have in here were Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. It's in there, check. And then, of course, Sir Gawain getting married, the marriage of Sir Gawain and Dame Ragnell. Those are my favorite ones. Do you have favorites that you insisted had to be in there?
I was preparing for this question and I was expecting you to ask, do I have one favorite? And I said, can I have three? But,
go for it. Give us the top three.
I mean, obviously there are parts that everybody's going to have a favorite that we couldn't get in, right? Because there's so much Arthurian literature out there. We know that Kevin Wetter and Fiona Tolhurst are coming out with a new Mallory edition. So we actually used their translation for this, but we deliberately made it so that you could, if you were teaching it, you could bundle the two texts together and teach all of Mallory. And so there are parts of Mallory that I really wish we could have gotten in, but didn't. I would say Gawain, yes. Mallory, yes. But I'm also been enjoying teaching the Chevalier de la Charrette, the Chrétien de Troyes. I thought it went on and on and on and on and on, and it's actually really good. And
it is really good.
So I would say that. Then I've also got new favorites. So I love the Merlin Ushba. It is glorious to teach and glorious to read. And then I also really like Morian. And I think if we're doing a second edition, I'm crossing my fingers there, I would insist on including more of the Morian.
Good idea. Good idea.
Yeah. What about you, Elizabeth? What are your favorite? Oh, and I also like the alliterative Mort in Elizabeth's translation.
Gonna make her blush again.
I've spent a lot of my life working on Thomas Mallory, so I guess he's my favorite. I have a huge brief for the Vulgate cycle, the whole cycle, which means, this much, this long. But the Lancelot, the cyclical Lancelot, I just think it's wonderful. And I think it's a very understudied medieval text, especially considering how popular it was. There's something like 500 manuscripts of the Lancelot floating around. And that's a lot. I only know of one other author that's got that many manuscripts in the Middle Ages, and that's Innocent III's The Contempt of the World. Okay. So it
tells you a lot.
Kathy had three, and Gawain and the Green Knight. I mean, to me, that is a masterpiece of world literature, no matter what you're talking about. If I had to put my favorite literary works of all time, it would be there.
Mm-hmm. And I forgot the Lancelot because that was new to me. Elizabeth pulled out those excerpts. Yeah, insisted. And I'm so glad you did, because that also, I like the love story between Galaho and Lancelot. So it's again a homosexual desire, but that is exquisitely done and really interesting. And the kind of triangle, the typical love triangle you would think would be between Guinevere and Arthur and Lancelot. But in this story, it's between Lancelot and Guinevere and Galahad. And they have a really interesting dynamic between the three of them. And it's really heartbreaking because Galahad realizes that Lancelot loves Guinevere and he is selfless enough to do everything he can to further the relationship of Lancelot and Guinevere. And it's tragic and exquisite and wonderful.
Well, one of the things I want to make sure that I emphasize here is that it is created as a teaching text in that the type of language that's used, the introductions that you have, the collection that you have is aimed at teaching. But for anybody who wants an introduction to this literature, I mean, Broadview editions are always great. And this one, I think, has it all. So for people who are not teaching or not students, it's still going to be just a really fun read because, as we're saying, these stories are just so much fun and beautiful and everything you could want. And the translations that you have here are super friendly. So hopefully everyone can check this out. But before we go, Kathy, I wanted to ask you, as a former president of the Canadian Society of Medievalists, to tell people that we do have a Society of Medievalists up here. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, thank you, Danièle. And thank you for the wonderful words about the book as well. But yeah, so there's a Canadian Society of Medievalists. I was the president. Elizabeth has been the president. And we try to include all medievalists in Canada who are professionals, but we also have medievalists who aren't part of a university and this isn't their job and they just started joining it for fun. We have a yearly conference which people give papers at. And it's the size of the society is really nice because everybody knows each other. We're all supporting each other. The conference, everybody goes to every paper. You don't get those terrible, more people on the panel than in the audience kind of sessions. And you find yourself, I want to go to a paper with, I don't know, Elizabeth, and she's put next to this person who does obscure seals and I think, that'll be so boring. And then I'm in there and it's fascinating. And so we have a student membership and an unwaged membership, and then a regular, if you're a university prof, membership. And our webpage is canadianmedievalists.ca. And
we have a journal.
And we have a journal. Your membership will get you our journal. And then we also post regular talks and so on the webpage.
Yeah. So there you go, Canada. We have our own Society for Medievalists. You can join it. It is a great place to be. Perfect. Thank you so much, ladies, for coming on and talking about Arthurian literature with me. It is just so much fun to geek out about it with you. So thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much
for doing it.
us.
Yeah, it's been great.
To find out more about Kathy's work, you can visit her faculty page at Dalhousie University. And to find out more about Elizabeth's work, you can visit her faculty page at the University of King's College, Halifax. Their new book is the Broadview Anthology of Medieval Arthurian Literature. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's going on, Peter?
Hey. So I think you can say that Hollywood movies tend to be loose with the truth when it comes to Middle Ages, right?
I think you can say that fairly, yes.
I'm going to tell you about this Russian movie, Soviet movie from 1938 that had a big impact. There's a battle called the Battle of Lake Pepias, or also known as Battle on the Ice. It happened in 1242. It was the Livonian Order versus Novgorod. The Novgorods win really very well. And it's a very well-known battle, if you know Russian history. So in 1938, this film comes by. It's called Alexander Nevsky. And it's about like one of the heroes of the Novgorod army. And it becomes a huge success. It's really well done for, if you can imagine, 1930s movies, right? So, And there's this pivotal scene during the battle, at the end of the battle, where all these Livonian knights, they're retreating and they try to regroup. And this battle is taking place on ice, on a lake.
Right.
And the ice breaks open, and all the men fall in. It's a great scene, except it's not true. It never happened.
No. Oh, no.
But the fun part is, after a few years later, everyone starts believing it's true, right? Like, books start putting it in, articles, encyclopedias, Wikipedia, of course, in this part of the soldiers fell in through the ice. It was totally made up by the director. it really was in 2006 that a scholar went in and like, hey, none of the sources say this. It was funny enough that there's 2 articles about that battle in that same journal. The first one has, oh, yes, and the Livonians died in the ice. One immediately after is like how this did not happen.
Oh, ouch.
Fascinating stuff. So I'm kind of just taking a look back at how this myth developed, and it's probably the greatest myth ever from movies. Even Braveheart doesn't hold a candle to that myth, right?
Wow, them's fighting words.
So yeah, we've got that piece on the website. Plus, you can also watch the video. And it's a great video if you want to see like guys falling, struggling through the ice. All these Livonian knights. It's great stuff. Plus, we have a piece about 7,000 weather reports from the 15th century. And this is a source I've really just started looking at. And it's a notary who lived in Damascus. His name was Ibn Tak. And he kind of kept his diary from 1480 to 1501. And he fills it with tons and tons of stuff. Like the part we're talking about here is his observations of weather, which he gives on a daily basis, right? So like one day, it's getting cloudy tonight, rain coming, that kind of stuff. But he also talks about experiencing a little earthquake. So people have gone in and made a database just of the weather stuff. But it's something I think, like if you're a scholar, you want to dive into a source for the rest of your life. This guy is great, right? Because he puts in everything. Like, he seems like, I'm a notary, so I got to talk about what I did today and what I heard. There's some crime that happened in the street next to me. He's got that. What's happening with my wife and kids? Got that. What he ate. He's a foodie, too. So,
if he had Instagram, he'd be taking pictures. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. This is a fun guy. Like, this source is just a gold mine for any kind of social historian. So I thought I'd put out a little piece just about the weather reports.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I think that a lot of people will not only want to see the weather reports, but who this guy is, because he sounds amazing.
Yeah, indeed. So we got all that and much, much more.
Perfect. Thanks, Peter, for stopping by and telling us what's on the website.
Thanks.
Thank you to everyone who so generously supports my podcast and the work of other indie historians through medievalist.net's Patreon page. As you know, patrons can access a whole range of goodies in addition to good karma. And now there's a whole new way to support the work that I do, as well as some of your other favorite medievalists. Medieval merch. If you've ever seen my super sweet 5-minute medievalist logo and thought, hey, that'd make an awesome shirt, you're in luck because medievalist.net has teamed up with TeePublic to bring you shirts, mugs, totes, stickers, and more. Now you can spread the medieval love even further by wearing your support on your sleeve. And did I mention you can even get merch of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight? Head over to teepublic.com/stores/medievalistsnet to grab your 5-minute medievalist shirt and let everyone know how awesome you are. That's teepublic.com/stores/medievalistsnet. For everything from Arthur to Archers, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or X at Medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, now out in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself a wonderful day.